I never thought my marriage would turn out like this. 2 years ago, Maggie was everything I wanted: charming, vivacious, and full of life. But now, standing in our dimly lit kitchen, I can barely recognize the woman I married. Her eyes dart around the room, avoiding mine, and her hands fidget with the edge of her sweater. She's been like this for months, erratic, unpredictable, and increasingly dependent on me for every little thing. "Did you hear me?" she asks, her voice sharp and impatient. "I said I'm going out tonight." I nod, trying to keep my tone calm. "With who?" She hesitates, just for a second, but it's enough. "Just some friends from work. You wouldn't know them." I want to believe her, but there's something in her voice, a flicker of guilt maybe, that sets off alarms in my head. I've been ignoring these signs for too long, brushing them off as paranoia. But tonight, something feels different. Later, as I sit alone on the couch, my phone buzzes. It's Mike, my best friend since college. His name on the screen feels like a lifeline. "Hey man," I answer, trying to sound casual. "Dude." Mike's voice is tense, almost hesitant. "I hate to tell you this, but I just saw Maggie downtown. She was with some guy, and they looked pretty cozy." My stomach drops. "What do you mean, cozy?" "I mean they were holding hands, laughing like they were on a date." I didn't want to say anything, but you deserve to know. I thank him and hang up, my mind racing. Maggie's been distant lately, always on her phone, always making excuses to go out. I've tried to talk to her, to understand what's going on, but she brushes me off every time. "You're overthinking things," she says. "You're too paranoid." But now, with Mike's words echoing in my head, I can't ignore the truth anymore. Maggie's been lying to me. She's been seeing someone else. When she comes home that night, I'm waiting for her in the living room. The television is off, and the only light comes from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the floor. She freezes when she sees me, her hand still on the doorknob. "We need to talk," I say, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. She sighs, dropping her bag by the door. "What now?" "I know about the guy, Maggie. Mike saw you with him." Her face goes pale, but she doesn't deny it. Instead, she crosses her arms and glares at me. "So what? You've been so distant lately. What did you expect?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Distant? I've been trying to hold this marriage together while you've been sneaking around behind my back." "You don't understand," she snaps, her voice rising. "You're always working, always too tired to spend time with me. I needed someone who actually cares about me." I want to argue, to tell her she's wrong, but the truth is, I don't know what to say. Maybe she's right. Maybe I've been so focused on keeping us afloat that I forgot to actually be there for her. But that doesn't excuse what she's done. "This isn't just about me," I say finally, my voice quiet but firm. "You made a choice, Maggie, and now we both have to live with it." She doesn't respond, just turns and walks away, leaving me alone in the dark. I sit there for what feels like hours, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of everything. My marriage is falling apart, and I don't know how to fix it. The woods were supposed to be a distraction, a way to clear our heads after weeks of tension. Maggie had suggested it, her voice unusually bright. "Let's just get away for a day," she said. "No phones, no work, just us." I agreed, hoping it might help us reconnect. But now, standing at the edge of the forest, I can't shake the feeling that this was a mistake. The trees loom tall and dark, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Maggie steps out of the car, her boots crunching on the gravel, and takes a deep breath. "Isn't it beautiful?" she says, her voice almost too cheerful. I force a smile. "Yeah, beautiful." We start down the narrow trail, the silence between us heavy and unspoken. Maggie walks ahead, her steps quick and determined, while I lag behind, my eyes scanning the shadows. The woods have a reputation, locals call them the Whispering Forest. They say strange things happen here, that people go in and never come out. I've always brushed it off as superstition, but now, with the trees closing in around us, I can't help but feel uneasy. "Maggie, maybe we should turn back," I say, my voice barely above a whisper. She stops and turns to me, her eyes narrowing. "Why? Scared of a little hike?" "No, it's just... this place gives me the creeps." She laughs, but it's hollow, like she's forcing it. "You're such a city boy. Come on, it's just a forest." I don't argue, but the unease settles deeper in my chest as we continue. The trail grows narrower, the trees denser, and the light fades until it feels like we're walking through twilight. The only sounds are our footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Then I hear it, a low, guttural chant, barely audible but unmistakable. "Cut, destroy, vanish," it repeats over and over. I freeze, my heart pounding. "Maggie, do you hear that?" She stops and tilts her head, listening. For a moment, there's nothing but silence. Then the chant comes again, louder this time, and Maggie's face goes pale. "What is that?" she whispers. "I don't know," I say, my voice tight, "but we need to get out of here." We turn back, but the trail seems different, now twisted and unfamiliar. The trees press in closer, their branches clawing at us as we push through. The chanting grows louder, more insistent, and I can feel it vibrating in my bones. "Cut, destroy, vanish." "This way!" Maggie shouts, grabbing my hand and pulling me down a side path. Her grip is tight, almost painful, but I don't let go. We run, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, until we burst into a small clearing. In the center stands an old, crumbling cabin, its windows dark and lifeless. "We can't stay here," I say, but Maggie is already moving toward the door. "It's shelter," she says, her voice trembling. "We'll be safe inside." I want to argue, but the chanting is everywhere now, echoing in my skull. I follow her inside, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. The floorboards creak under our weight, and the walls seem to lean in, closing around us. Maggie sits on the floor, her arms wrapped around her knees, and I sit beside her. "What is this place?" she whispers. "I don't know," I say, but the words feel hollow. The cabin feels alive, like it's watching us, waiting. Hours pass, or maybe minutes, it's hard to tell. The chanting fades, replaced by an oppressive silence. Maggie's breathing slows, and I think she's fallen asleep. But then she speaks, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry." "For what?" I ask, though I already know the answer. "For everything," she says. "For the lies, for the guy, for all of it." I don't respond. I don't know how. The weight of her confession hangs between us, heavy and suffocating. Then, the chanting starts again, louder than before, and the air grows cold. I look at Maggie, but her eyes are wide, fixed on something behind me. I turn, and my blood runs cold. A shadowy figure stands in the doorway, its form shifting and indistinct. Its movements are jerky, unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an unseen hand. It steps closer, and I can see its facey, or what should be its face. There's nothing there, just a void, dark and endless. Maggie, get behind me, I say, my voice shaking. But she doesn't move. She just stares, her eyes wide with terror. The figure reaches out, its hand, if you can call it that, stretching toward her. I grab her arm and pull her back, but she's frozen, her body rigid. Maggie, I shout, shaking her. Snap out of it! She blinks, and the spell breaks. We scramble to our feet and run, crashing through the underbrush. The figures chanting, echoing behind us. Cut, destroy, vanish. We don't stop until we reach the car, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. Maggie collapses into the passenger seat, her face pale and drawn. I start the engine, my hands trembling on the wheel, and we drive away, the woods fading into the distance. But the chanting stays with me, echoing in my mind long after we've left. And when I look at Maggie, I see something in her eyes, something dark and unfamiliar. Whatever happened in those woods, it changed her, and I don't know if we'll ever be the same. The days after the woods were a blur. Maggie wasn't the same. She was quieter, more distant, but there was something else, something darker lurking beneath the surface. She started talking about the woods constantly, about the figure we saw, about the chanting. At first, I thought it was just shock, that she'd snap out of it. But she didn't. If anything, it got worse. One evening, I came home to find her sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by candles. The room smelled like burnt wax and incense, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. She was muttering something under her breath, her eyes closed, her hands resting on her knees. Maggie, I said, my voice cautious. What are you doing? She didn't answer, just kept muttering. I stepped closer, and that's when I heard it, the same chant from the woods. Cut, destroy, vanish. My stomach twisted. Maggie, stop it. You're freaking me out. Her eyes snapped open, and she looked at me, but it wasn't her. Her gaze was empty, hollow, like she was looking through me. It spoke to me, she said, her voice flat. In the woods, it told me things. What things? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood and walked to the window, staring out into the night. It said I'm special, she said finally, that I have a purpose, but I need to let it in. Let what in? I asked, my voice rising. Maggie, whatever you think happened in the woods, it wasn't real. It was just stress or fear or something, but it wasn't real. She turned to me, her eyes blazing. You don't understand. You never understand. It's real, and it's here, and it wants me. I took a step back, my heart pounding. This wasn't Maggie. This was someone else, something else. Maggie, please, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. You're scaring me. Let's just sit down and talk about this. She shook her head, her expression hardening. There's nothing to talk about. I've made my decision. What decision? I asked, but she didn't answer. Instead, she walked past me and into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, trying to make sense of what just happened. But there was no sense to be made. Maggie was slipping away, and I didn't know how to bring her back. The next few weeks were a nightmare. Maggie became obsessed with the idea of letting it in. She started spending hours online, researching obscure religions and rituals. She'd disappear for days at a time, only to come back with wild stories about enlightenment and spiritual awakening. I tried to reason with her, to get her to see a therapist, but she refused. You don't get it. she'd say. This is bigger than you. Bigger than us. Then, one night, she came home with a group of people I'd never seen before. They were dressed in dark robes, their faces solemn, and they carried strange object scandals, incense, a small wooden box. Maggie led them into the living room, where she'd set up a makeshift altar. I stood in the doorway, my heart racing, as they began chanting in unison. "Maggie, what the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. She turned to me, her eyes glowing with a fervor that made my skin crawl. "We're performing a ritual," she said, "to let it in." "Let what in?" I shouted. "Maggie, this is insane. These people are—" "They're my guides," she interrupted. "They understand. They know what I need to do." I looked at the group, their faces blank and unreadable, and felt a surge of anger. "Get out of my house!" I said, my voice low and dangerous. They didn't move. Maggie stepped forward, her expression hardening. "This is my house too," she said, "and I'm not leaving." I wanted to argue, to fight, but the look in her eyes stopped me. There was no reasoning with her, not like this. So I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. I spent the night at Mike's, trying to calm down, trying to figure out what to do. But by the time I got home the next morning, Maggie was gone. The living room was a mess, candles knocked over, incense scattered across the floor, but there was no sign of her or the group. I called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I texted her, begging her to come home, to talk to me, but there was no response. Days passed, then weeks, and still no word from her. I filed a missing persons report, but the police didn't seem to take it seriously. "She's an adult," they said. "She'll come back when she's ready." But I knew better. Maggie wasn't coming back. Whatever had taken hold of her in the woods, it had her now, and I didn't know if I'd ever get her back. Then one night, I got a call from an unknown number. I answered, my heart in my throat. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end. Then a voice, Maggie's voice, but different, colder. "I'm ready," she said. "Ready for what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "To let it in," she said. "But I need your help." "Maggie, please," I begged. "Just come home. We can figure this out together." She laughed, a hollow, empty sound. "You still don't understand. This isn't about us anymore. It's about something bigger, something you can't comprehend." "Then explain it to me," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "Help me understand." There was a long pause, and for a moment, I thought she'd hung up. Then she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "Meet me at the cabin, tonight." The line went dead, and I stood there, my mind racing. The cabin. The place where it all started. I didn't want to go back, but I didn't have a choice. Maggie needed me, and I couldn't abandon her, not again. So I got in my car and drove, the woods looming ahead like a dark, foreboding shadow. Whatever was waiting for me there, I knew one thing for certain: it wasn't going to be easy. I couldn't take it anymore. Maggie's disappearance, her cryptic phone call, the constant fear that something terrible had happened to Harriet was all too much. I had to do something, even if it meant going back to that cursed cabin. I grabbed my coat and headed out the door, the cold night air biting at my skin. The drive to the woods was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, and my mind raced with every possible scenario. What if Maggie was hurt? What if she was beyond help? What if I was walking into a trap? I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away, but they clung to me like shadows. When I reached the edge of the woods, I parked the car and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound in the stillness. The trees loomed ahead, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I took a deep breath and started down the trail, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The cabin came into view sooner than I expected, its silhouette stark against the moonlit sky. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light flickered from within. My heart pounded as I approached, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. Not now. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of burnt candles, and something metallic and sharp. The room was a mess, the floor littered with broken glass and scattered papers. And there, in the center of it all, was Maggie. She was kneeling on the floor, her back to me, her head bowed. Her hair was tangled, her clothes torn, and her hands were clasped in front of her like she was praying. But it wasn't Maggie. Not really. There was something off about her, something wrong. "Maggie?" I said, my voice trembling. She didn't move. I stepped closer, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. "Maggie, it's me. Please talk to me." Slowly, she turned her head, and I froze. Her eyes were black, completely black, like voids. Her lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't her smile. It was too wide, too sharp, too wrong. "You came," she said, her voice a low, guttural growl. "I knew you would." "Maggie, what's happening to you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She stood, her movements jerky and unnatural, and took a step toward me. "I told you," she said. "I'm letting it in, and now it's almost done." I took a step back, my heart racing. "Maggie, please. This isn't you. You need to fight it." She laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "Fight it? Why would I fight it? It's giving me power. It's making me whole." I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "This isn't what you want. You're not thinking clearly. Let me help you." She tilted her head, her black eyes boring into mine. "You can't help me. No one can." Before I could respond, she lunged at me, her hands clawing at my face. I stumbled back, barely managing to dodge her, and fell to the floor. She was on me in an instant, her weight pinning me down, her fingers digging into my shoulders. "Maggie, stop!" I shouted, struggling to push her off. But she was stronger than she looked, her grip like iron. "You don't understand," she hissed, her face inches from mine. "This is what I've always wanted, to be free, to be powerful, to be more than just your wife." I managed to twist out from under her and scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Maggie, this isn't you. Whatever's inside you, it's lying to you. It's using you." She stood, her expression twisting into something between rage and sorrow. "You're the one who's lying," she said. "You've always lied to me, pretended to care, pretended to love me, but you don't. You never did." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "That's not true," I said, my voice breaking. "I love you, Maggie. I always have. But this isn't love. This is madness." For a moment she hesitated, her black eyes flickering with something familiar, something human. But then it was gone, replaced by that cold, empty stare. "You're too late," she said. "It's already done." She turned and walked to the altar, picking up a knife from among the scattered objects. My heart stopped as she raised it to her chest, her eyes locked on mine. "Maggie, no!" I shouted, lunging toward her. But it was too late. The knife plunged into her chest, and she let out a scream that echoed through the cabin. I caught her as she fell, her body limp in my arms, her blood soaking through my clothes. "Maggie, please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "Don't leave me." She looked up at me, her eyes slowly returning to their normal color. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted—" Her voice trailed off, and her body went still. I held her, sobbing, the weight of her loss crushing me. The cabin was silent, the chanting gone, the shadows receding, but the damage was done. Maggie was gone, and I was alone. The days after Maggie's death were a haze. I barely remember the funeral, the empty condolences, the pitying looks from friends and family. All I could think about was that night in the cabin, the way Maggie's eyes had turned black, the way she'd smiled as she plunged the knife into her chest. It haunted me, every waking moment and every restless dream. I tried to move on, to rebuild my life, but the guilt was suffocating. I kept asking myself the same questions. Could I have stopped her? Should I have seen the signs sooner? Was there something I could have done to save her? But there were no answers, only the endless loop of regret and self-blame. Then, one night, I got a call from an unknown number. My heart raced as I answered, half expecting it to be Maggie's voice on the other end. But it wasn't. It was a man, his voice low and urgent. "You need to come to the cabin," he said, "tonight." "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "There's no time to explain," he said. "Just come, alone." The line went dead, and I stood there, my mind racing. I didn't want to go back to that place, not after what happened, but something in his voice, something desperate, made me hesitate. What if it was a trap? What if it was another trick? But what if it wasn't? What if there was a chance, however small, to find closure? I grabbed my coat and headed out the door, the cold night air biting at my skin. The drive to the woods was a blur, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I reached the edge of the woods, I parked the car and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound in the stillness. The cabin loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the moonlit sky. The door was slightly ajar and a faint light flickered from within. My heart pounded as I approached, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. Not now. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of burnt candles and something else, something metallic and sharp. The room was a mess, the floor littered with broken glass and scattered papers. And there, in the center of it all, was a man. He was tall, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes, and he was dressed in a black suit that seemed to absorb the light. He turned to me as I entered, his expression unreadable. "You came," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of urgency. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "My name is Daniel," he said. "I was a friend of Maggie's." I stiffened at the mention of her name. "What do you know about Maggie?" He hesitated, his eyes flickering with something guilt. "Fear? I know what happened to her," he said finally, "and I know why." "Why?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Why did she do it? What was she trying to prove?" Daniel shook his head. "It wasn't about proving anything. It was about power, about control. She thought she could harness it, but she was wrong." "Harness what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The entity," he said. "The thing that took hold of her in the woods. It's ancient, powerful, and it feeds on fear and despair. Maggie thought she could control it, but it was too strong. It consumed her." I felt a surge of anger. "And you just let it happen? You didn't try to stop her?" Daniel's expression hardened. "I tried, but she wouldn't listen. She was too far gone." I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "So what now? What do you want from me?" Daniel stepped closer, his eyes locking onto mine. "The entity is still here," he said. "It's not done with you. It wants to finish what it started." I took a step back, my heart racing. "What are you talking about?" "It's been watching you," he said, "waiting, and now it's ready to strike." Before I could respond, the room grew cold, the air thick with a palpable sense of dread. The candles flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. Panic surged through me as I heard the chanting. "Cut! Destroy! Vanish!" "Daniel!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "What's happening?" But he was gone. I was alone in the darkness, the chanting growing louder, more insistent. I stumbled backward, my hands groping for the door, but it was gone. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing colder with every passing second. Then I saw a shadowy figure, its form shifting and indistinct. It stepped closer, and I could see its face, or what should be its face. There was nothing there, just a void, dark and endless. "Maggie?" I whispered, though I knew it wasn't her. The figure tilted its head, as if considering me, and then it lunged. I tried to dodge, but it was too fast. Its hand, if you could call it that, gripped my arm, and I felt a searing pain, like my skin was being torn apart. I screamed, struggling to break free, but its grip was like iron. "Let me go," I shouted, my voice raw with fear. But it didn't. It pulled me closer, its void-like face inches from mine. I could feel its breath, cold and rancid, and I knew I was going to die. But then, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to let it win. Not like this. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small silver knifey, a gift from Maggie years ago. I didn't know if it would work, but I had to try. I plunged the knife into the figure's chest, and it let out a scream that echoed through the cabin. Its grip loosened, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The figure writhed, its form flickering like a dying flame, and then it was gone. The chanting stopped, the air grew warm, and the candles flickered back to life. I collapsed to the floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body trembling with exhaustion. Daniel appeared in the doorway, his expression a mix of relief and sorrow. "You did it," he said. "You banished it." I looked up at him, tears streaming down my face. "What was it?" "A fragment," he said. "A piece of the entity that took Maggie. But it's not over. The entity is still out there, and it's stronger than ever." I shook my head, my mind reeling. "What do I do now?" Daniel stepped closer, his eyes locking onto mine. "You fight," he said. "You learn, and you make sure no one else falls victim to it." I nodded, though I didn't fully understand. But one thing was clear. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. It's been a year since that night in the cabin. A year since I last saw Maggie, since I faced that thing in the darkness. A year since my life changed forever. I've tried to move on, to rebuild, but the memories linger like shadows, always just out of reach but never truly gone. I moved to a new city, a small town where no one knows my name or my story. It's quiet here, peaceful, and for the first time in years, I feel like I can breathe. I started therapy too, though it's been slow going. The therapist says I need to forgive myself, to let go of the guilt, but it's easier said than done. How do you forgive yourself for failing someone you loved? I still think about Maggie, though not as often as I used to. Sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of someone who looks like her, and my heart will skip a beat. But it's never her. It's never going to be her. One afternoon, as I'm walking home from the grocery store, I run into an old acquaintance, Maggie's father. He looks older, more worn down, but there's a kindness in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. We exchange awkward pleasantries, and then he says, "I heard about what happened. I'm sorry." I nod, not sure what to say. "Thanks." He hesitates, then adds, "Maggie, she wasn't well. Even before all of this, I think she was searching for something she couldn't find in this world." I swallow hard, the guilt rising in my throat. "I tried to help her. I really did." "I know," he says, his voice soft. "But some people, they're just too far gone. It's not your fault." His words are meant to comfort, but they only make the guilt worse. If it's not my fault, then whose is it? Maggie's? The entities? The world's? I don't know. And I'm not sure I ever will. We part ways, and I continue home, the weight of his words heavy on my shoulders. When I get inside, I sit on the couch and stare at the wall, my mind racing. I think about Maggie, about the life we could have had, about the choices we made. And for the first time, I allow myself to feel the full weight of my grief. I cry, really cry for the first time since her death. The tears come in waves, each one carrying a piece of the pain I've been holding on to. I cry for Maggie, for the person she used to be, for the life she could have had. And I cry for myself, for the person I've become, for the life I'm still trying to build. When the tears finally stop, I feel lighter. Not healed, not whole, but lighter, like I've taken the first step towards something better. I get up and walk to the window, looking out at the quiet street. The sun is setting, casting a warm golden light over everything. For the first time in a long time, I feel a flicker of hope. Maybe I can't change the past, but I can shape the future. Maybe I can't bring Maggie back, but I can honor her memory by living a life she would have been proud of. I take a deep breath and let it out slowly, the tension in my chest easing. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen overnight, but I'm ready to try, ready to move on.